You've heard me say this before, and you'll hear me say it again in the future. As Canadian Unitarians, our interdependence calls us to love and justice. Love and justice. Love that asks us to enlarge the circle over and over again until all are welcome. And love becomes justice when lived in public, when we work towards shifting those systems of exclusion to inclusion. And so this month, our theme is considering those acts of resistance which help us live into that vision of love and justice. And Kathleen shared the story of the March on Selma, that pivot point in the civil rights movement in the 60s. And it was also a moment for Unitarian Universalism as well. Selma taught us the power of resistance. After public and violent attacks on Black citizens in Selma at the first attempt at marching, that Monday, March 8, 1965, Martin Luther King puts out a call to clergy for support to come to Alabama and stand with African Americans in their fight. And UUs answer the call. The Reverend James Reeb is a young white minister who's working with an African American community in Boston. And so the very same day he gets the call, that night he is on a flight to Selma with fellow UU minister Orloff Miller. And Reeb's wife Marion and 4 young children stay home, and he tells her, "It's the kind of fight I believe in. I want to be part of it." The next night, Tuesday, Reeb eats dinner at Walker's Cafe with Miller and another UU minister from California, Clark Olson. And there are about 60 or so UUs, ministers and lay people, in answer to Dr. King's call at that time. And after dinner in Selma, the 3 young ministers walk along the street, and 4 white local men come along and begin yelling at them. Reeb, Miller, and Olson walk a little faster. And the 4 locals run after them, and one of them is carrying a baseball bat. He swings it at Jim Reeb's head, and Jim goes down. And the other 2 are punched and kicked until they are all lying on the sidewalk. And the attackers tell them that this is what it is like to be a Black person in Alabama. The attackers leave, and Miller and Olson help Reeb to stand and get him to a hospital, but he collapses into unconsciousness later that night. And his wife makes the decision to take him off life support on Thursday. After this, the march moves forward, and it will take place in another 10 days. And this time, over 750 UUs participate. And my colleague Mark Morrison-Reed estimates that 1/4 of all UU ministers in the US participate in the March on Selma. And there are lay people there as well, one of whom is Viola Liozzo, who's a member of a Detroit congregation. And she drives down to Selma, and she's a mother of 5. And she tells her husband, "It's everybody's fight. There are too many people just standing around talking." Now, as she has a car, she is assigned to drive marchers back from Montgomery, Alabama, back down to Selma. So after she does one drop-off, she's on her way back up to Montgomery. She's on the highway, and a car pulls up beside her, and a white gunman shoots, killing her instantly. James Reeb, Viola Liozzo, and Jimmy Lee Jackson, an African-American activist, all 3 are killed in Selma by white men for calling for voter registration rights for African Americans, for the right to vote in a democracy. It's everybody's fight. And the collective resistance at Selma helped shift the national attitude. People are raged at the acts of violence towards the protesters, and 5 months later, the president does sign the Voter Reform Act, ending overt racism in voter registration. My colleague Mark Morrison-Reed, who has written a book about Selma and Unitarian Universalism, notes that in that month in Selma between Martin Luther King's call out and the march, there is genuine integration in the movement. And he sees integration as meaning the parts formed a new whole. Neither part was subjected to the power of the other. And he says values and practices meshed when Black and white stood together, sharing and struggle and song, discomfort and celebration, needing one another. Values and practices mesh. As people of the chalice, we seek that integrity, that our lives might express our principles in our daily choices. And at Selma, in giving themselves over to that time and its demands, to their conscience and sense of honor, to their faith and what it stood for, our UU ancestors lived their integrity, they lived their values, and they lived into their power. And this is collective resistance, to live the values we claim, to come together in a new way, to stand shoulder to shoulder against injustice, remembering that each fight is everybody's fight. Selma was a pivotal moment in the civil rights movement, and for Unitarian Universalists, it brutally brought home the price African Americans paid for being Black in America. And Selma taught us the power and price for standing up for people's rights. Now, after Selma, it seemed like this denomination would be itself a beacon of integration. And there were many congregations that did integrate people of color, working intentionally and tirelessly. But mostly, we stayed as we are, white and middle class. And many African Americans who turned towards Unitarian Universalism with that promise of Selma in their hearts found that we weren't able to live up to that promise and left. So we still have work to do beyond and within our congregations. Racism is everybody's fight.
As people of the chalice, we are idealists. We aspire to be radically inclusive, to continually enlarge that circle of welcome, to form a river of grace where all can enter as they are. And yet, as Selma and the years after show, we don't always succeed. We're still embedded in systemic racism. We still struggle with how to be radically inclusive.
And yet I often think that we, as a religious community, our purpose is to enlarge the circle. It's what we've done from the beginning, enlarge what it means to be a religious community, enlarge what it means to be human. From the time we proclaimed that a creedless faith was open to all, to ordaining women a century before any other tradition, to supporting LGBTQ rights. This congregation hired the first openly gay minister in Canada, Reverend Mark Mosher de Wolf. And in the 1970s, UU ministers in Canada began to offer services of union to same-sex couples long before marriage equality happened. We would conduct ceremonies and offer a certificate. And when I became a lay chaplain in 2002, this was actually still the only option for same-sex couples. And as the fight for marriage equality intensified, Grand River Unitarian became part of a small coalition of religions which supported the marriage of same-sex couples. And I think there in KW it was us and the United Church and the Baha'i. And we went as a delegation to our local member of parliament, who met us very graciously, listened to us, and then said he agreed. So we didn't really need to resist there. At the same time, over in Calgary, the Unitarian Youth Group decided to make a giant Pride Rainbow banner in support of marriage equality in Canada. And their Pride Rainbow project resulted in the creation of a 500-foot banner. And I was there at the banner's unveiling in May 2005 at the annual conference that was held in Hamilton that year. And we were in this big hall, and we were surrounded by this wave of colors ringing the whole center. And the air was filled with pride and excitement and hope and possibility. And after the conference, the youth took it on to Ottawa, and the rainbow banner flowed proudly onto Parliament Hill that June. Resistance can be beautiful. And on July 20th, 2005, equal marriage became law in Canada. We were part of that fight. Our values and our practices meshed, and we shared in struggle and song, discomfort and celebration, knowing that we need one another. Now, as Canadian Unitarian Universalists, we are a small denomination, teeny tiny, to be completely accurate. There are less than 4,500 of us across a country of over 37 million people. So teeny tiny. But as the saying goes, you don't underestimate the tiny if you've ever spent the night with a mosquito. In this congregation alone, we have helped to found the Voice of Women, a peace organization, Dying with Dignity, and Canadian Unitarians for Social Justice. Just this year, we have supported the creation of the Mississauga Climate Action Group. So we may be a teeny tiny mosquito, but we have the power to influence social norms in this country. We are doing the work, and the work is not done. The circle still isn't large enough. This year, our educational focus has been on nurturing inclusivity, learning more about white privilege and pervasive systemic racism. And we are learning how to be allies, to stand in solidarity with another's struggle, how to decenter ourselves, to offer help that is needed, rather than the help we want to give. And this isn't easy work. Living our principles takes intention, and it's not always popular. With time and perspective, Dr. Martin Luther King has become a hero and a martyr. But that wasn't the case at the time of Selma. Back then, he was a troublemaker, a problem to be dealt with. He was reviled by many, and he spoke about issues white people didn't want to hear about. People who stand up for the oppressed are not celebrated. They are ignored, and they are despised at least as often as they are admired. And it's worth remembering. People who stand up are not immediately cheered on and celebrated. In the beginnings, people like Dr. King are on the edge of the inside of the circle, pulling it larger, pushing it out. And there at their edge, their attention is on who is outside the circle and who is being left out. And the people who stand on that edge, who speak out, they're calling the rest of us to pay attention. And those in the center are being asked to notice what it is we don't want to see, that we might prefer to ignore or dismiss. And hopefully a few will turn around and see the issue and join the push at the edge of the circle. And in the end, that goes on and on, all of us needing to change, to loosen control, and let that circle widen. Social inclusion depends on people who can see that this fight is also their fight, simply because our principles call us to justice, equity, and compassion, because every person has inherent worth. Collective resistance succeeds, sometimes slowly over many years, when those with privilege and power choose to stand with those in struggle and let them lead. Every fight for justice is everybody's fight, because we are all in this interdependent life together. So may we work together to resist injustice, seeking to live our values in practice. So say we all.